Hi, and welcome to today's webinar. It's titled, it's titled Challenges and Opportunities with Technology, Innovation, and Intellectual Property in Muslim-Majority Countries. My name is Tabrez Ebrahim, and this webinar is sponsored by George Mason University Center for Intellectual Property and Innovation Policy. I will go through the format a little bit and then just turn it over to the speakers. Our format is going to be provide a brief introduction and then allow the speakers to go in order and present a brief presentation, and then we'll go into Q&A, and I'll welcome taking your questions that will show up on my side in the Q&A feature here on the webinar. First, I want to thank George Mason University Center for Intellectual Property Innovation Policy. A little bit about the center. It produces research, education, and service at the intersection of IP, that is intellectual property, and innovation policy to better understand and shape the means of innovation as a positive force for good. Again, my name is Tabrez Ebrahim. I'm on the faculty at Lewis and Clark Law School in Portland, Oregon. I'm also a scholar with the Center for Intellectual Property and Innovation Policy. I'll be moderating this webinar, and I have some colleagues with me today. I'll do a brief introduction. One of the panelists unfortunately could not join, just had something come up very last minute, and hope everything is well. So Bashar Maklawi is unable to join, but we have others, and we're looking to have a great discussion today. I'll briefly mention the names. So we have Kevin Tamm, Saad, Hasan, and Jeff Whittle, who each will be introducing themselves and sharing their backgrounds. They're extremely experienced and really well regarded in this field. And I'm going to turn it over to Kevin first, and then we'll go to Saad and then Jeff. And they'll also introduce themselves in more depth and talk about a little bit about what they do and how their work relates to this topic. Kevin?
Okay. Can everyone see my screen with the slides in the presentation mode? Good. Okay. Well, thanks, Professor, for the introduction, and thanks for the opportunity to speak here today with everybody. I think what the speakers and I are going to do at the introduction here is just lay the groundwork for questions to come in, for the professor to have us answer questions, and spur some conversation. So as the professor said, my name is Kevin Tamm. I'm currently Senior Counsel Intellectual Property at a company based in Houston. It's called SI Group. I started at this company last year. Prior to that, I was at a law firm in Houston where I worked on a lot of patent prosecution and transactional patent work for entities in Saudi Arabia, such as Saudi Aramco. We worked a lot on their subsidiaries around the world, their joint venture partners, and I worked a lot also with U.S. companies who are trying to do business in the Middle East. So, for our company currently, it's a global company. We have over 2,000 employees spread across the world with different manufacturing sites. We do a lot of business in the Middle East. It's a very important market. We operate there with a joint venture in Saudi Arabia called Gulf Stabilizer Industries. We work closely with them to basically produce and market products throughout the Middle East. And our company generally produces chemical additives that go into plastics production, rubber production, such as tires, oil field solutions, and different lubricant solutions as well. So, not only is the Middle East important to us as a production center, it's important to us as a, marketing and sales center as well. So just to give a little bit of background here for our discussion today, when we're talking about the GCC, or Gulf Cooperation Council, this generally people are referring to 6 countries. You have Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. So that's what is typically referred to as the GCC. And I'm going to go through some patent specifics here to set up our discussion, but we also can discuss trademarks, trade secrets, agreements, joint ventures, different things as questions come in. So before January of 2021, you had unified GCC patents. If it was granted, the invention was protected in 6 GCC member states, and you had one application for protection in 6 jurisdictions. So prior to January 2021, oftentimes what our clients would do, they would actually file specific country patents, such as in Saudi Arabia, and a GCC patent application. So you could have specific individual intellectual property protection and or this 6 country-wide unified GCC patent. That has changed, however. So now what the GCC wants and what clients are doing, typically you're filing for a patent at the national patent offices in a GCC member state, and the national patent office reviews the application. So the GCC basically changed the procedure for how these patents are filed and how they're examined. And that's going to affect how IP is viewed between the countries. So now a granted patent only has effect in the jurisdiction of the original national patent office. And the current filing practice, like I said, you can file in these individual GCC member states in 2 ways. You can go through what's called the Paris Convention or through what's called the Patent Cooperation Treaty, or the PCT. So the PCT route takes longer, but typically what folks are doing is you would file an international patent application and then select which of these 6 countries in the Middle East you'd want to go into for protection. So this is a very current and recently changing process. In November of 2022, the GCC announced that you can file in the GCC patent office as what's called a receiving office. And then the grant certificates will be issued by local patent offices. So this is just happening now, January of 2023. It's expected to cover Bahrain and Kuwait, and then other GCC countries are expected to follow shortly. So to summarize these 2 slides, at least the patent acquisition process in GCC countries is currently changing. It's in flux. It's something you want to pay attention to for, clients both within these countries and with outside of these countries. And then just to set the ground for our discussion in terms of litigation, there are no unified courts relating to GCC patent matters. So to enforce patents in these countries, each individual member state will examine the dispute. So, the courts in these countries are supposed to look at provisions of the GCC and regulations of the national country itself. So there's kind of 2 sets of rules courts would look to. The different GCC countries are highly influenced by opinions of courts of other GCC countries. So for example, if you would have an opinion come out of Saudi Arabia and you're later looking to enforce in Kuwait, it would be likely that Kuwait would look to the earlier decision of a Saudi Arabian court, but it's not bound to do so. And with the technical subject matter, oftentimes it's difficult in Saudi Arabia to have the expert opinions rendered. So if you do get a good expert opinion rendered in one court, you would definitely want to use that in other jurisdictions. So joint ventures, this I'm going to talk about just from my experience and kind of the general thoughts currently, but this obviously changes over time. So when we're talking about IP rights of our larger global organization and joint ventures in the Middle East, the IP rights typically are not transferred to the Saudi Arabian entity or other JVs. The intellectual property, such as trade secrets, patents, trademark, know-how, it's made available to the local entity through licensing agreements. And part of that is because enforcement of claims can be time-consuming in Saudi Arabia. we did have an IP issue come up recently with our joint venture in Saudi, but we handled it with the parent companies outside of Saudi Arabia. So, you know, even though the issue was local to the country, our parent company and the other company's parent were not located there, so it was handled external to the country. So one of the issues is with JVs in Saudi, their authorities have oftentimes found that even after a joint venture is terminated, the partner within the country still has IP rights to continue using after the agreement is concluded. So, you know, one of the things you want to think about with JVs is who owns the IP rights, how are they licensed, and how would a JV terminate in a GCC country if it is to terminate. And then this is just the specifics of what I was mentioning. And so when we're talking about the JV agreements, you might have the actual joint venture company in a GCC country create intellectual property. If the party does create intellectual property and you want it to be held by a parent company or a JV partner outside of the country, you typically have to compensate the JV in some way so that the IP can be transferred out of the JV. And this can be an in-kind payment, such as secondment of R&D staff or provision of research facilities to the JV. It doesn't have to be a cash payment. So, you know, there are these kinds of considerations when you're talking about IP, particularly with a joint venture. You know, who's going to own it, how it would be transferred, how it would be licensed, how it would be used. And at the bottom here, we're just saying you want to include these provisions in JV agreements, and you want to think about the end at the beginning. Basically, when you're setting up a company there, how will it operate during its life, but then how will the agreement terminate if it does terminate? So that oftentimes can be one of the most important considerations with the IP. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our next introduction speaker.
So I think we'll be maybe changing the order here. I think Saad's connection may have just dropped. So let me just give it a moment just to make sure I didn't get any sort of email or anything. And I think it looks like, Mary Claire, you may need to add Saad as a speaker. I just got a message. If that's possible, we will do that. We'll just pause for a moment. If not, then we'll go to Jeff. I do see a quick question, and we'll normally hold the questions to the end, but I see one in the Q&A for Kevin. So while we're waiting for Saad to join, Kevin, there's a question here saying, can you please summarize the trends that we can observe in the GCC patent rights? Is it correct that there is more decentralization? Seems like a quick enough question we could take here as far as trends.
Well, the trend since the GCC started, you know, accepting patent applications is that they've always increased. So the one trend is that GCC filings have become basically more and more popular. I think that's right. I think the trend toward decentralization was the idea behind the January 2021 decision. You know, it's an interesting office because typically when we would have clients file both in the individual member states and in the GCC, you know, you would be getting very similar decisions typically between the individual member states and the GCC. The prosecution decisions typically overlapped very closely when you were talking about patents. So, you know, I think on the ground, probably a lot is not going to change. I think you're still going to be seeing similar decisions from these different GCC member states. But I do think the logistics of filing and who's going to be issuing these decisions is going to change.
Great. Thank you very much. Kevin, really great introduction. It'll spur some more questions, I'm sure. I'm going to turn it over to Saad to start his presentation, then we'll hold a Q&A for, feel free to type in your questions. I'll just go to it after the last speaker.
Sure. I'll just go ahead and share my screen.
And Saad, I did a very brief intro for you, so feel free to talk about yourself and your firm.
Yeah, sure. No worries. So I've got an intro about myself and the firm in the presentation. So I'll just share that and then we can go ahead. All right, guys. So very nice to see you all. It's going to be an absolutely fascinating discussion, first of all. I think we should have a lot of fun, as much fun as IP can be. I'm sure I'm talking to the right sort of audience here for that. But generally, I'd like to give an intro on myself and the firm, Sturgeon Capital, and what we exactly and why we're so absolutely fascinated, number one, and number two, absolutely excited about intellectual property, technology, innovation, and ideally really making a difference in people's lives through being an impact-oriented fund. With regards to such, it really sort of is, number one, an absolute privilege to speak to everyone here who are also accomplished in their fields as well. So without further ado, here we go. So I'll tell you a little bit about Sturgeon Capital. Our VC team was formed in 2016. We're a London-based fund, and generally our team is distributed across our geographies. But generally speaking, what that means is that we have both local as well as an international understanding of how venture capital moves and how it generally is distributed in terms of a product set across different markets. Now, in terms of where we're really looking to invest, and you guys will find out a bit more about that in the coming slides, but it's generally Muslim majority countries at this point of time, which have truly been categorized as frontier markets, and generally what we're looking to do is ideally bring local international capital and expertise in both on how to build IP in specific jurisdictions when it comes to software businesses. So I'm not going to be talking too much about hardware businesses because that's not necessarily our skill set. But when it comes to software businesses, that is something that we know well and have done so in our past lives as well as operators. So a little bit about me is that I started investing in technology companies as an analyst at Morgan Stanley on their alternative investments team. I then moved to a private equity manager called JLL, and there met the Uber team and absolutely fell in love with it in mobility as a service after investing in that team. And really it made me so interested that I wanted to become a mapping as a service entrepreneur and actually developed a high IP sort of product and software, which was where we licensed it to multiple ride sharing and logistics companies as well as delivery companies in North America. Now, after that company got acquired, we generally wanted to, well, as founders in that company, we all had different ideas about what to do. And what I really fell in love with was investing in frontier markets. And as a frontier market investor, I think the number one thing is that you really don't have a ton of services that are actually being provisioned by the private sector, which means that almost everything that a individual in frontier market economies is going through, and especially Muslim majority countries, is generally provisioned by the state, like the everyday sort of things that people are used to. Now, what this has done is that there are terrible inefficiencies when you allow effectively the government to do most of the productive things and the infrastructure management um, in specifically countries like Pakistan, Bangladesh, Egypt, etc. I can't really speak for GCC countries because they've done a pretty good job in terms of the RT in Dubai, in terms of the Saudi Foundation, PIF in Saudi Arabia, for example. But I think across the world, what we're really excited about is the intersectional nature of AI, cloud computing, and smartphones, which are leading a multi-decade secular trend in digital adoption and innovation. So when we talk about investing in our target geographies, why invest now of all times, right? Well, I already told you it's a multi-decade secular trend, but really today is where the inflection point is, right? So when we look at emerging markets, we think about China and India as foremost. And if you look at the amount of investment that goes into China and India every year in terms of really building innovative businesses, you're already seeing a ton of progress and impact. So if you were to look at a payment system, for example, that is more advanced in the US and most of Europe, I would say look at UPI in India, right? If you were to look at a super app, for example, that is a one-stop shop compared to a multitude of apps in the United States or the Western world, you should look at WeChat in China, right? And generally, what we're seeing is that in most Muslim majority countries, because there is a geopolitical sort of tightrope between being aligned with the Chinese sphere of influence and then being aligned with the American sphere of influence, what we've seen is that business models like transport and logistics, they look a lot more like China and ASEAN countries, while business models like fintech, for example, look a lot like our Western counterparts, such as Zelle in the US or like Venmo or like PayPal in payments, and then like Uber, etc. In mobility, and beyond that in software companies. Like Cloudways, etc., that are also very, very interesting SaaS products. Now, when it really comes down to it, I think for all our countries, what we really measure is internet penetration. And what we've seen is that uh, post 80% internet penetration in any country, and all of these countries do have that, what you see is an inflection point, and that's what we've observed. And this is generally internet accessible through the smartphone. So the smartphone is at the center of the technological revolution in these countries. And smartphone penetration has jumped from 40% all the way up to 54% in most of our target geographies in the last 4 or 5 years, which is a compelling increase in the number of people who have smartphones across demographics. Now, what is effectively the price on offer? The price on offer is very simple. It's almost an addressable market of 200 billion of annual digital revenue by 2030. Today, we're already at 108 billion of annual digital revenue in our geographies, which are more than 500 million people and should rise to 658 million people by 2030. Where the immediate opportunities really are in fintech, logistics, and marketplaces. Really things that touch everyone's life every day. So when we talk about IP, it really has to start when it comes to software in critical mass buildup, right? What that really means is that there is a differing set of capital requirements in order to build critical mass. And if critical mass were to be defined, it would be defined simply as reaching a set number of users that allows you to extrapolate trends going forward at a reasonably accurate level and better than most of your competitors, which are not tech-enabled. This is effectively the core to where one can effectively really build data ownership. And through data ownership is the only way you can really build lasting, sustainable, monetizable IP. Now, when it comes to investments and the amount of money that it generally takes, this is over hundreds of deals that we've conducted in our lifetimes as VCs at Sturgeon Capital. But generally, when we look at pre-seed deals in our frontier markets, you're looking at $100,000 to $200,000 to start something. And then when you reach a certain amount of traction, we're generally looking at $500,000 to $1 million in order to really sort of get to some level of demonstratable product market fit. And then beyond that, we look at a $1 to $5 million sort of investment into really optimizing the organization so that it is a superior coordination mechanism with enterprise readiness. And then of course, Series B is all about growth. It's about growth capital. And generally we don't look beyond a $3 to $4 million check, which most companies can utilize pretty well. And then beyond that, really, it's all about getting ready for IPO, and really we're initially thinking about it in the sense of how do these companies then measure up to their public market equivalents, both in terms of IP ownership and in terms of the depth of IP that they've created through their critical mass buildup. So here's a very simple example. When we talk about leveraging technology to build IP, right? So a small example are digital ledgers. A digital ledger is something as simple as having a two-sided notebook that most merchants in emerging markets use to collect basically how much money they owe and how much money they're owed. And a digital ledger effectively is a smartphone app that millions of merchants are using throughout emerging markets to effectively manage their finances better. Now, the recording of these offline transactions through smartphones provides a data aggregation mechanism that can be monetized further onwards through being an intermediary of allowing for these merchants to utilize digital payments to convert the offline transactions to online transactions, which are also then verifiable transactions as they go through a system which can actually account for them, and they're not necessarily just cash-based transactions. Now, okay, so what do I do with all this data that I've aggregated? Well, what you can do after it's verified data is feed it into a machine learning algorithm, for example, that creates a credit score. That credit score is based on financial data as well as non-financial data, like the person's usage habits of their smartphone or their bill payment history, or things that effectively allow us to understand if these guys will be a credit-worthy borrower or not. You then you then lend to a MSME or a micro, small, medium enterprise. You record the outcome, as in, was the loan paid back or not? How many times did the person take the loan again? And update the score. As their credit score becomes more and more based on the data that's being reported, it really builds an unassailable advantage versus your competitors, who will now need to effectively work with almost where a 1-year head start with data recording and monetization can actually end up being a 5-year sort of gap in between the level of data quality and the level of data monetization that you've already done. And really it's effectively all about scale, and that means revenue scalability and the recurring nature of revenue that you can build with the IP as well, right? So in numbers, it's pretty simple, right? And this is something which is a live example where I haven't necessarily disclosed the ledger. But this ledger has almost 1.2 million monthly active users, right? These monthly active users use this app, hundreds of times a month. And the offline transactions recorded per day on this ledger are almost $100 million a day, right? The online transactions, which means payments that have been settled through this ledger app, are almost 2 million, right? Which is effectively a 2% penetration rate. Now, guess what? All of these transactions effectively are also lead to some economic activity that is happening. And that economic activity is what we call gross merchandise value, or the amount that the merchant borrows in order to finance inventory, for example. Now, this app effectively finances $5 million worth of inventory a month at this point of time, growing 20% month on month, and generates around $100,000 in revenue a month, right? Now, if you were to think about digital payment penetration, smartphone penetration, the quality of smartphones, the quality of data aggregation, the quality of the credit score over time, at 20% conversion of that $100 million in ledger activity per day to online transactions, you're looking at almost a 10x increase in monthly revenue at the very least in the next 4 years, at the rate at which they're growing, even with tapering in place. So, really, when it comes to IP, what we're really excited about are SMEs, right? And in Muslim majority countries, the reason why we're really, really excited is that you've got a population of 500 million plus or so, and you've got a GDP of around $1 trillion, right? When you combine the GDPs of the 5 countries that we generally look at, or the 4 countries that we generally look at, 4 regions that we look at, with Central Asia, of course, being a region of almost 3 or 4 countries together. And what we see is that the SME population really is less than 15% of the population, which means that close to 55 million people are SMEs or MSMEs in these countries, according to at least tax data and everything like that. And what they contribute to, though, is almost 40% of all the country's GDP, right? Which means effectively $400 billion. Now, that $400 billion has to be captured somehow, right? That $400 billion, if you can facilitate the movement of that money, either through fintech or through marketplaces or through SaaS or through any technology medium that's able to collect that data and then utilize that data in order to really add value-added services, you're looking at generational value creation for these countries. And so really, when you combine sort of those steps together, that is what really drives IP creation, in my view, right? Is obviously being able to aggregate data, then being able to curate that data, and then after that, being able to build recommendations from that data. And if you can do those 3 things, it really creates a lasting impact in products that can stick in that merchant or that consumer's mind forever. So that's my sort of view on how technology can effectively drive critical mass, how it can effectively, and how IP can be built through utilizing that critical mass and the data that it provides in order to really build compelling use cases like digital ledgers and other businesses as well. Yep. So thank you, guys.
Thanks, Saad. Great presentation, really great insights. And we saw a different perspective than Kevin. And I'm going to turn it over now to Jeff. Who I'll let him introduce himself and his firm, and I'm sure we'll learn new things. I see a few questions in the chat window, and then after Jeff is done, I'll make sure to address those, and welcome taking additional questions in the chat window too. Thank you.
you see that okay? Is that visible to everybody?
I don't see it yet, but
Okay. Me. It's on my screen, but I need to back. There we go.
so I'll just jump in a moment just for logistics while we're getting the presentation up. I'll mention one can also ask questions anonymously. I see some questions that way, so you have the option to do that as well, or you can ask as is, and then we'll have a great discussion and go in the questions that we have received here. Great. Okay.
How's that? Is that better?
Yes. We can see your desktop, and I guess just with presentation mode, we'll be ready to go soon.
All right, my name is Jeffrey Whittle. I'm the global head of the energy practice group for Womble Dickinson. It's a international law firm with offices in the United States and the UK. I've been practicing law for 30 years, also managed their Houston office, and I've been traveling to the Middle East for 15 years. I'm sorry, the Saudi Peninsula, and visiting different countries there and working with different clients. My practice is focused heavily on technology and intellectual property and deal transactions and protection nationally and internationally. I work with clients both from the Peninsula region that both want to invest in the United States or have filing issues or ventures in the United States, as well as other countries throughout the world. I also work with clients from the United States and other countries that want to invest and work in the GCC countries or those countries on the Arabian Peninsula, as the case may be. These are the areas I'm going to focus on primarily. I know that Saad was so gracious and looking at a wider perspective, but what I want to talk about primarily is the Arabian Peninsula. And that's primarily because that's where most of my experience is in that region. I have a little experience in the other areas, but most of it's in this region. So my thoughts and comments will be focused primarily on that for these discussion purposes. This is just information. Many of you are probably already aware of this, so I'm probably, not making you aware of something you already don't know, but you can see the size of the population in these regions. I will say that many of these areas are heavily, have a heavy degree of immigrants to these countries compared to those that are more native to the country. So there'll be a high percentage of, you might call them expats or other immigrants that come to these countries. And so the population will reflect the immigrants as well. And I've seen many charts, and I encourage you to look at them as well too, for those that would involve other countries and what that percentage of immigrants is. I know, for example, I attended the World Cup over in Qatar and in Doha, and a great experience. But as an example, that country has about a population of 3 million people. Only about 10% of those, about 300, are local natives to that country. So that just gives you a ratio of, it's not always that great in all countries, but I know that the UAE and Qatar and and a few others. It's a high ratio like that. And so something I think you should be aware of in terms of your relationships and investments moving into that area. This is an example of the expat article or whatever from LinkedIn News that shows the region and that high percentage of immigrants in that region. And I think it's important to know from an investment point of view, depending on what your targets are and what you're looking to do there, and how you're going to do business in that region. This gives you a sense of the population of Saudi Arabia. The reason I point this out is because you can see, and Professor Ebrahim made this point as well as others, the population is really growing exponentially. You can see it's primarily heavy in the younger ages. So there's going to be a tremendous even further growth for the future, which I think is exciting from an investment point of view, exciting for doing business there. And it also shows their leadership in that region of the world. As their population grows, they'll take more and more leadership on a global level at these Muslim influenced countries or leading countries. I think we'll just see that continued growth, and that's pretty exciting for me. From that growing population trend, you see the one of the things that was launched, and again, you may be familiar with this as well too. I want to point it out because I do think it's significant, is that the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia launched in 2016 its Vision 2030, which ends in about 7 to 8 years from now. So they're about halfway there. I think they've made excellent progress. If you haven't been to that region, I encourage you to make sure you include, Saudi Arabia in your stop, your investment, your cycle to look at that. The three main pillars of that vision are a vibrant society, a thriving economy, and an ambitious nation. And that was announced by their Council of Economic Development and Affairs. What I liked and was so pleased by this is the stability which that added to the country, and the investment stability, and the high level for intellectual property and other started to go up during this time period, which I think is really significant. So from 2016, just in the last 7 years, as Kevin mentioned, the filings in the GCC region and that region have just increased phenomenally on a percentage basis. I think the patent filings might have been up 30% in 2021 or as compared to the previous year, 2022. So you'll see just the investment and the surety of the investment has really gotten much better and more significant. As part of that goal, those goals, they want to increase their private sector contribution to the GDP of 40 to 65%, and they want to increase the foreign direct investment by 0.7 to 5.7%. I think they're well on their way to do that now, and I think again it's significant, speaks well for intellectual property and its contribution to the economy. These are some opportunities. I think it's significant. As a little more background on myself, I served on the Saudi Authority for Intellectual Property International Advisory Board as the U.S. representative for 2 years when it launched in 2018. And Darren Tang, who's the current WIPO Secretary, World Intellectual Property Organization Secretary, also served on that advisory board with me, as well as representatives from the European Patent Office and those in Central or other South America, as well as the director from Jordan Patent Office. So I know they're doing a lot to assure investors that you can protect patents and technology there and your investment there with intellectual property, whether it's with trademarks or copyrights or patents. But I think it's significant that you consider these things moving forward, because there will be a continued investment and push in a lot of the construction and investment in new cities and new technology and new developments there on what I would consider a massive scale are a result of this Vision 2030. And that has a ripple effect through the UAE and Bahrain and Qatar and other areas as well too. And I think it's, again, significant. You'll see a lot of movement towards the arts, movement towards tourism and things like that in the country as well, which I think are significant. So here's some considerations. What I strongly encourage this audience to consider is that there's the middle layer, this commerce layer for investment, is where the opportunity for biggest growth, in my view, is. It's not that the retail and consumer are not, but on the more industrial side, it's really, in my view, in this middle layer. This middle layer is more of where the manufacturing and bigger service providers are located. And so if you think about historically, a lot of that region is in the last few decades has developed on strength of oil and gas. And because it's been a strength of oil and gas, and it's a big part of those companies that are over there, part of those being chemical as well too. Those I would call kind of big companies. I think they're, what they do is bring in outside external investors typically, or companies that will help provide services to those big companies at some level. And so even companies like a Halliburton or Schlumberger or a Weatherford will bring in, service providers, and there's same is true with other types of industry. So I'm not just picking on them, but what I think is significant about it is that those companies typically have facilities in those countries, but the manufacturing for a lot of that is done in other countries and then shipped into the Arabian Peninsula. And where they're trying to make this transition in the next 7 to 8 years is in this middle region right here, which is what I really want to encourage this audience to consider for investment purposes, because this is really where a lot of booming is going on. If you're looking for a venture with a big co, that's a different type of investment. There's different types of issues dealing with that. But if you're looking for, a joint venture or something to do and grow your company or expand opportunities in investment, that middle region is really ripe for continued growth. They have had some growth, but manufacturing equipment, coatings, whatever you're going to do, if you think about they're trying to initiate an automotive business there. So what they will need is the components and other parts there to stabilize and keep their economy less tied specifically to oil and gas over time. So this allows diversification, which I think that's where that huge amount of opportunity for investment and where IP can be protected and ventured into that country is in this middle region here. And so I encourage this audience to think about that as well too, from an investment point of view. What are some of the challenges? The challenges are the big co domination. If you want a big project done in that region, typically they would go with a big company because big companies know how to handle big projects and know how to manage them and do project management effectively, or hire teams that can help do that effectively. So there's that big company domination. There's a lot of government-owned companies, which you might call a national company of some sort. That is a challenge at times because the size, the policy changes there. And where they're missing is what I mentioned here is this kind of small to medium enterprise companies. And you'll see them moving now in the second phase of Vision 2030, as well as other countries like the UAE. They recognize this shortcoming. And so they're trying to move into that for diversification purposes. What are the opportunities? The opportunities, I think, is stability, the WIPO compliance. I think you'll see that the GCC and the SIPE, which is the Saudi Authority for Intellectual Property, have moved more into WIPO compliance over the past few years. That's a real goal of theirs. They recently added Dr. Guri to their advisory board there. Those may be familiar with as a former Secretary General of WIPO as well, to help them continue to move into that stability idea, that stability policy with respect to patents and trademarks and copyrights. And that's really pretty exciting, actually, from that perspective. There's a huge amount of incentives for original equipment manufacturers or companies that want to venture there. There's terrific financing from some of their public financing sources, and they're creating even more vehicles for financing or doing ventures. Why is that significant? Because it hedges the risk that companies that want to invest over there would take by allowing a backstop on those JVs for that investment. And that adds, again, some more stability there, which I think is really significant. And then last, training. There's universities there in Riyadh and Dhahran and in Jeddah that are really training skilled individuals. And that's not to the exclusion of Jordan or the UAE and those universities as well too, which are outstanding. They're really coming into their own. I think you'll also see that universities like KFUPM are now one of the leading university or patent filers, not only in the country, but in the world. You'll see their rankings continue to grow. The universities, the university parks can help partner with companies to help train the skilled workers that would be needed for this in this middle layer. You can bring and transfer know-how over there effectively through these JVs or joint ventures, as Kevin mentioned that his company has seen and does with their joint venture. But you can help transfer that know-how and help develop this kind of middle layer again of the economic engine that's going on in that area of the country. And that's what I just wanted to encourage everybody to think about. I'm glad to take questions about IP like Kevin and Saad as well. But I just wanted to point that out in terms of strength of IP and the investment opportunity. It's a little bit more background about myself, but glad to take questions too. So thank you.
Thanks, Jeff, and thanks, everyone. This has been a great set of topics, very diverse vantage points, and really informative. I want to turn it over to Q&A, and we have in the Q&A chat some activity going on. So first, let me say there's been some answers. I'll still kind of direct this and get some verbal discussion. We're doing pretty good on time. First, as far as contact info, I have provided the panelists here their email addresses. Some may have been on their slides anyway, but it's in the Q&A chat discussion. So all of those email addresses are provided in case anybody would like to contact the panelist. There's several questions. If you have been answered already in writing, but I think it may be worthwhile still going through them, especially since others may be listening to this. So we covered patent rights, and I think I'm just going to go through this sequentially and add to some of the existing written discussion. And I think the other panelists can see this. So let me pick up on the question related to creative IP, that is footage, photos, music, and print used in media. There was already some addressed on this by Saad, but if others have comments on this, that is, the question is about, do you have any deal clearing such rights for companies in other countries that are using Gulf IP, an alternative for Gulf countries that want to use IP content created in the US? And again, this is related to creative IP, footage, photos, music, print, and so on that's used in media. If there's other thoughts, please feel free to jump in.
I'm sure Jeff has experience in this as well, but in terms of, I would say trademark, you know, in certain GCC countries, it can be difficult because of obviously different languages. You know, you may be applying for a certain trademark, let's say logo, image, or brand name, that the country in question finds confusing with another brand. For instance, if you're trying to trademark Panther and someone else in the country is using the term Panther, even for something completely different, the trademark offices there, just based on the language different, may say, you know, the consumer is likely to confuse these logos or images or names because of their similarity, regardless of the difference in goods. So, I've seen some difficulty with that. I agree with Hasan. I think the countries want to enforce protection. I don't think companies are trying in these countries to rip off other companies, necessarily logos or trademark or copyright IP. But on terms of the acquisition side, I think it can be just difficult in terms of different language.
Yeah, I would add, I agree with what Kevin said. I think the biggest issue would be, I think there is still some risk of using trademarks or brands inappropriately there. They've had some historical problems with that. I think they're getting better. But I still think you got to be careful about that risk in terms of protecting your brands as you move in there. In terms of clearing such rights, I think the number of filings and the number of protection vehicles there are lower. So the body of clearing is much smaller on a relative scale than you might say compared to the US or Europe or Japan or maybe even China from that perspective. So I think it's a little easier to clear the rights if clearing means I can use that without concern about interfering with others' rights there. To Kevin's point, I think trademarks would be your biggest risk here. Copyrights, if you're dealing with an original work, you're less likely to run afoul of somebody else there from a clearance perspective. I think of footage and photos and music and print is more copyright and trademark kind of focused, if you would, as long as you're the original rights holder.
Thank you. I see some comments by Saad written. I don't know if Saad, you want to add to this. If not, I'll also jump forward to some of the other questions and go through them sequentially. But there's some in the text. Hopefully the participants can see this as well.
I can speak a bit about the why we think that a lot of IP isn't really filed in Muslim majority countries. I think generally it's expensive, to file globally. And when it comes to local sort of IP filing, a lot of it is not necessarily recognized by other jurisdictions at times, which can be, which is not necessarily conducive to any sort of quick or sort of localized IP filing, which means that most of the time when you actually have IP worth protecting, you're going to file it with the US Patents Office or something a bit more global in nature. I think down the line, it's really, really important that there's some sort of recognition mechanism or a more globalized framework for IP recognition, which where you could have member states, etc., and have member bodies, but they should have a sharing system that allows for IP infringement to be detected. And largely, I think the core reason why a lot of the infringement happens by local IP filing is because there's really a lack of infrastructure available that really allows for a lot of that IP sharing to occur without very, very sort of expensive and long drawn processes. So I think a bit of automation, a bit of sort of global recognition and data sharing, and as well as a bit more encouragement at the academic level for university professors, for example, in these countries, would help in recognizing and stimulating patent filing. I think if you can do all three, it would really help in stimulating the ecosystem to do that.
Yeah, I'd like to add on to what Saad said on that question too, is that the Saudi Authority for Intellectual Property has run a campaign try to encourage people to respect IP and understand what intellectual property is. They ran a really colorful campaign on social media with soccer players or football players that was really kind of well received in terms of having stars talk about their respect for IP. Clearly, they would want to respect IP. The stars would, because of their likeness and their image and their name and their brands, that surround that, and which you can see some of the significant money that's being transferred over there for some of those famous sports athletes were pretty phenomenal, as others have seen. So you can see that investment in that side. So there's definitely an uptick in that direction, because those companies that sell the gear and endorse the players, they want those rights protected too as well. So I think that's significant. I think you can see more investment dollars coming in to that. But I think if you look at the site.gov site, you can see their emphasis on trying to connect and build that infrastructure that Saad mentioned. They're working on that. They're working on having agents and attorneys and judges familiar and trained with this in a significant way, which I'm personally very pleased with. I think that shows that there is that idea of that investment coming in. I think also there's been less IP protection filed there because of that investment need. Foreign investment, when it comes in, typically wants protection around their intellectual property assets. And if that infrastructure, to Saad's point, is not there to help support that, then there's going to be less filings there in general, and less investment in general coming in. But now that we've seen that stabilize more in that region, you'll see that investment continue to flow in. And that's what I've seen over the last couple of years, which I think is really exciting to see.
Great. Thanks. Good perspectives. I want to make sure I cover all the questions. There's still some in the open part of the Q&A chat, but just to quickly go through this, I think we've covered some of the subsequent questions, and let me just quickly summarize. So one question was about the number of patents filed and in what areas, and Kevin has addressed that, and we started talking about the next question as well. But the question about the number of patents, Kevin mentioned kind of a statistical breakdown by percentage, the high percentage being in chemistry and chemical engineering, 46%. I think that should be mechanical engineering, electrical engineering at 23%. Then petrochemical and natural gas engineering, 19%, and then medicine and biotechnology, 11.5%. So I think that's covered. There's another question about still relatively low number of patent filings. What are the biggest impediments to these countries embracing IP and better appreciating the benefits of patent filings? What role, if any, can organizations and companies in the West or the OIC play? I think we discussed this a little bit, but let me pause here and see if anybody would like to add to Saad's comments that patents are not filed locally because of enforceability. There's some additional things that Saad has mentioned, but anybody here, Kevin, Saad, or Jeff, want to add to that regarding relatively low number of patent filings? I think we did discuss this some, but maybe there's some additional comments, and then we'll go on to the subsequent questions.
Yeah, I think Saad and Jeff's comments on this point, I totally agree with. The only thing I was going to mention to Saad's point is, people on the call may be aware that very recently, in Europe, they're about to finally release this summer what is called the unitary patent system. And in Europe, historically, if you wanted to enforce patents, you had to do that country by country. So in Europe, you could basically obtain patents easily by doing one European patent. But to enforce it, you had to enforce it in 20 to 30 individual European countries. Well, now they will be moving to a system where you can obtain a unitary patent in Europe and enforce the patent through one judicial system that will be effective throughout all of Europe. So I will note, though, that the negotiations to create that system, I want to say, took, probably between 10 and 20 years. And every time they try to release this system, it gets pushed back. So It was supposed to start in January of this year, then April. Now it's, I think, pushed back to June. So it's a very difficult thing to do. All of the member states have to agree to it. But once it is released, it should be a much more efficient system for enforcement. Now, I think what Saad was saying is true. You know, one way to increase not just filings, but people actually enforcing is if you could do it not just on a country by country basis, but regionally. And right now the GCC just isn't set up that way. But I think going forward, you know, the more regional cooperation you have, you know, the more people would be interested in investing in IP there.
Let me move on. I think we've covered that a good amount, and we've covered some of the challenges with IP in these markets. I don't know if there's other comments. Saad addressed a little bit about this being slow and hard to navigate for the private sector. Are there other challenges that, besides some of the ones mentioned here? Are there coordination? Are there other issues from your experiences?
I'll take that one. I think in terms of, I think one thing that is a huge coordination mechanism and how it lacks is because there's a diversity of languages with regards to local IP filings. So filing in Arabic, for example, in some jurisdictions is, you know, and how the courts effectively interpret, you know, localized sort of language-based translations of IP documents, etc., is actually very much a coordination challenge in the sense of having some sort of standardized. So you know, we try and go for as much standardization as possible, but what happens at the local level in terms of language coordination is that you've got Pakistan, which has effectively a Persian script along with the Urdu language as the official language. And that is very close to Hindi, which is an Indian language, verbally spoken, and close to Farsi, which is the language of Iran. But generally, if you look at Bangladesh, though, they've got a different script and a different language, Bengali, and the script is more of a Sanskrit oriented script. And even though the lingua franca is English in terms of at the court level for both these countries, that's not necessarily true for let's say when there is some serious debate on the IP itself, right? So in terms of language challenges, a lot of the court-based sort of proceedings, because you've got two official languages, can end up in a Spanglish type of proceedings, and that can be a bit you know, inaccurate to say the least. And the Arab world, of course, has Arabic, but then you've got modern standard Arabic that most people use in official government documentation. But generally, you know, if you were to look at the Maghreb, for example, Morocco, etc., Tunisia and Libya and Egypt and the Gulf states as well as Saudi, there's varying levels of interpretation required to be able to interpret each dialect as well. So I think in terms of standardization and really having some sort of, you know, I think the unified standard, like Kevin talked about, would be an absolute godsend in terms of really unifying everything in place and really making things as simple as possible.
Thank you. Thank you. I'll move on to the next question. I may lead off with it and then turn it over to my colleagues as panelists. So the questions, there's a couple of them related to social justice and human rights considerations. And I'm sorry if the anonymous feature didn't work, but the questions about and Saad addressed some of this. Will the panel members address social justice and human rights considerations in investing in the Arabian Peninsula states, or is it just going to be more of the same about investing because one can make money there? I'm not one of the panelists, but I'll start off a little bit and then turn it over. So as a scholar and as an academic, I write mostly on theory and what we call normative legal scholarship. And I am addressing some of this in my current work, and I hope to share it with the members of this community, particularly academics. In particular, what my research is looking at is the intersection of intellectual property and Islamic law. And while here in the US and so-called Western countries, a lot of the focus is on economics and incentives, I argue in some of my papers and my forthcoming work, this balanced approach that I think theologically and based on qualitative interviews justifies more of a balanced approach. That is, while still recognizing incentives and private property rights, the Islamic view from a theological standpoint should also recognize issues that are, I think, limitations in the US and Western countries, such as issues with access and distribution and human rights. So this law and religion perspective from a more academic and theoretical sense, I think provides a different perspective of intellectual property than in other traditions. And so a lot of my work is aiming to blend theory with application and inform application in policy. And I think from a theological sense, which I'm driving from interviews and talking to those skilled in this area to help formulate an alternative theory. There may be more practical aspects that panel members here have regarding social justice and human rights considerations. I have more theoretical view that I just shared. But if anybody would like to add on their experiences, feel free. And Saad has added some comments in writing here.
Yeah, well, one thing that I would add is specifically in terms of our mandate as a venture fund, we only invest in things which are true holders and enablers of human rights and social justice. And one of the key tenets of our investments, because it's generally DFIs and sovereign funds, etc., that are our LPs, we tend to have a huge focus on impact. And impact effectively for us is beyond just sort of, talking about SDG goals. It's really about it's more about for us to be able to actually build a valuable consensus in society around how on how things should be valued and how diversity should be valued, and generally how to treat people better and to treat people as effectively globalized sort of and equivalent citizens. In the Arabian Peninsula, I know no one is perfect and no state is perfect in the world, but I think in terms of the work that has happened in terms of in the UAE, for example, you've got a wage system for migrant workers. For any worker that is dependent on earning and remitting back funds to their family, you've got a wage protection system. I think, when we look at sort of Western states, that is not actually in place. There is no such thing as a wage protection system. An employer does not have to remit funds into a bank account that is managed by a payment system, which automatically deducts that amount and puts it into your worker's pocket. I think, a lot of things that when we talk about worker rights and everything like that, a lot of these countries are actually leading the way through technology. And in terms of in Islam, etc., and if you're talking about that, it's when it comes to worker rights and contract law and being able to effectively really define in terms of basic human rights, there's no one that disagrees that the pursuit of happiness, life, property, protection of such is inherently required in all these regions and countries. It would be an antithesis to the societal laws for anyone to think that this is not the norm. Otherwise, these societies would have completely collapsed until now. They are functioning societies, even so, if less so, due to economic circumstances rather than effectively cultural circumstances. I think being able to separate the two is entirely possible. and really these things work in parallel. They don't necessarily work, with one or the other. If you've got no food on the table, you're going to think about a lot of things to do it, and they may not be they may not be great things to do, and they may impinge upon the rights of others, but only through some level of equality of opportunity, or at least an egalitarian sort of society in terms of, you know, the with regards to systems that work, and IP is so important in that. As a founder in these countries, if there wasn't some level of IP protection and some level of enforcement, no one would be investing in here either, right? We know that there is risk, but that risk is mitigated through the will of society itself to encourage economic prosperity.
And I think what I would add is that if I've seen, as I mentioned, I've been traveling that area for 15 plus years, and I've seen that change. At times it seems slow, at times it seems moving much faster, and I think you'll see it opening up more and more in terms of being able to respect more and more human rights and social justice issues. Part of the issue too, to my view, is getting the message out about what they're doing already in some areas. For example, on the energy side, they've been working the last decade on carbon capture, but that message has not been sent out to the world. They've been trying to address climate issues for quite a while, and they're trying to get more and more done so that message can get out. I think also building out infrastructure in that region or those regions has been significant. Emerson Electric, for example, did a significant investment to help build out the IT systems and the backbone of the communication sector, along with other companies in that area. That allows investment to come in, and allows communication, allows social media and those type of vehicles to come in, so that the communication and education can occur in these areas, and which actually facilitates what Saad mentioned, a lot of the investment on the mobility side, huge amounts of investment on the mobility, so that there can be communication to individuals, there can be highlights of human rights or social justice issues throughout the public in general. I think what's also fascinating is that with that, you're starting to capture and get more images of the geography of the region that a lot of citizens in that region have not even recognized or seen themselves, and it educates them more and more about that, and that comes through investment, and that investment in building out that infrastructure and building out those communication vehicles allows change to occur and facilitates the change. So I think from that perspective, the investment makes a lot of sense to help move the country into, kind of the global community, on some of these issues.
Okay, great. I wanted to, I'll keep this flowing. I know there may be some other comments. Saad had to hop, and want to thank him for his contributions and input from the investor perspective. Let me move on. I think we had some good discussion there, and let me also give a little bit of a promotion for the Center for Intellectual Property and Innovation Policy that's hosting this. There will be a event in late April related to this topic of IP and perhaps social justice and those sort of issues. It's a panel on the future of IP and religion. I intend to talk a little bit about that topic of IP and sort of the economic perspective and the social justice perspective as well in that discussion. Tentatively, it's on April 27th, and I'm sure there'll be announcements made about that. So we'll have a much more in-depth discussion on this topic. Let me move on and some of the other questions, and I think we may wrap up in 10 minutes. Let's see if there's more questions. We may go longer, but there's a question regarding individual GCC countries and the judicial history for each GCC participant. Therefore, does the GCC bind all participating member countries to the GCC patent prosecution history? I think Kevin had started talking a little bit about, I think, on the litigation side, but maybe you have some thoughts, or maybe Jeff has thoughts on this as well. So that's the next question. We'll continue sequentially.
From my experience, they can be very similar between countries, but in terms of them being binding, I would say no. like I mentioned, we had a number of clients that would file individually in countries and file at the GCC level. And to one of the points that was made earlier, the GCC actually, in my opinion, was quite good at considering earlier work done by the European Patent Office, the Japanese Patent Office, or the United States Patent Office. They oftentimes weren't starting from scratch with the work they were doing. So I think there was good coordination there. But you would sometimes see some differences between the Saudi national work from SAIP versus the GCC. I mean, it was similar, but I wouldn't call it binding.
That's my experience too, as well. It's not binding, but I also think that SAIP has been influenced heavily now by both the Korean and the Singapore patent offices in terms of style, and that's where they're moving. They've hired a lot of examiners from that area to help them on their examination procedures. But I agree with Kevin. I think they're not necessarily finding it binding. They're influential, but I don't think it's binding on those countries. I also like Kevin's idea of kind of promoting the idea of a unified system of enforcement or unified patent in that region. I think that's a positive kind of step forward if that could occur at some point, similar to Europe. That would bring some unification to a lot of this process. But I would guess or speculate that's a ways away.
Great. Okay, let's continue. The next question is related to the Berne Convention. Are the GCC countries signatories to the Berne Convention? Is there a process whereby protection is accorded to foreign IP, such as photos, footage, music, etc., and GCC can assert their rights? Is this all now country by country post 2021?
Jeff, I'll let you comment on that.
I think the it's not unmuted.
I think it's country by country. I don't think it's the GCC. I don't think it's all Berne Convention. I think SAIP has agreed to the Berne Convention. I think be careful about agreeing to when you say agree to conventions. The U.S. technically has not agreed to everything in the Berne Convention. Even the U.S. Has modified laws that reflect some changes with respect to that. Although they're a Berne signature to the Berne Convention, they get exception for their authors' rights laws that the U.S. has that's slightly different. And so just be a little careful on that when you do it as a country by country, because I think you'll see that the countries that have agreed to the Berne Convention will make some similar type exceptions or tweaks there as well too.
Yeah, I'm looking at a map here, and it looks like most of the GCC countries are signatories to the Berne Convention. But I would agree with Jeff, if you're actually enforcing copyrights, that's going to vary country by country.
And just check it carefully. That's what I'm saying.
So the next question is about copyright. Particularly, the question is about one of the most important challenges in these Muslim majority countries is in the field of IP is copyright infringement, especially licensed software. How do you see mechanisms of combating copyright infringement in these countries, especially that the public administration itself is being used softwares like Windows illegally? Okay, so there's illegal use of this apparently.
Yeah, so I'll jump in here if that's okay, Kevin. So one thing is that definitely register your copyrights there, so that there's no doubt about. I'm a big proponent of registration. I always will be. I think for your software you should pursue registration there. Number one. Number two is I think there's been a big increase in respect for copyrights in general there. It doesn't mean you're not going to be, you're going to be fine and you won't have any infringement. But by starting with protection, you're going to be able to have some rights to enforce, and those courts are going to appreciate that. And you have a lot of those intellectual property authorities and offices standing behind you when you go in to try to enforce against an infringer. historically, they have had problems with significant copyright infringement, both in terms of media and software. And so just like you would in many instances with other intellectual property and software, you want to make sure that you have the keys locking and tracing and doing everything you can to use password protection and the right access to it. Obviously, you want to use all those procedures to do that as much as you can. And then they do respect agreements. I think you'll find that particularly on the Arabian Peninsula, that agreements and contracts are respected. So I would definitely make sure that your language and your licensing agreements and your distribution agreements are really strong and protect those rights, and that you've got legal remedies pursuant to those contracts. I don't know if Kevin wants to add any more to that.
Yeah, I agree with Jeff. I think one of the keys is, when you're talking about copyright, you just want to remember that it's protecting your code or the specific say expression of your technology. It's not protecting the function. So you want to register your copyrights. You want to not maybe give your specific code to a software or to something that you might consider a trade secret even, because the question of infringement comes down to, is it truly copied, or do they take it and change it and somehow make it their own? So I think, like he said, with licensing agreements, with a JV agreement, it's a question of what do they have access to? Your source code or just a user interface. That's a big question. And to his other point, I agree. I think a lot of companies, throughout the GCC right now, I think are becoming highly invested in protecting IP. The joint venture our company works with there, like Jeff said, it services a lot of customers who are national companies, Sabic, Saudi Aramco, NatPet. So when you're dealing with these large companies, you do not want to be someone risking IP or infringing IP or breaking a contract, violating a license. We see, I think, increasing respect for IP rights. So once you have something in an agreement, hopefully that would help you prevent any type of what I'd call infringement or counterfeiting.
Great, thanks for the collective input here. The next question, I think I understand it, but I may reword parts of it or just add a little bit of input. It's regarding difficulty in becoming a citizen of the GCC state. Is that correct? Marriage. And is the right of publicity protected in GCC states? I don't know if those on the panel can address this directly. I may have a related formulation of this question. I think Jeff had talked about a lot of immigration to these countries, and I believe as a result of that, they may not be citizens, and perhaps that has some impact on IP. I don't know if that's the direction of the question, but that's that's what I'm guessing on it. But let me see if panelists here have some thoughts on it.
Jeff, if you want to start.
Sure. Best I can understand the question as well too. I think it's a little. So first of all, in terms of citizenship, you can file for IP. You do not have to be a citizen of that region to file and get protection on intellectual property there. From my experience, in terms of how to become a citizen, it is more difficult in some countries than others to become a citizen. A lot of it has to do with parental birth, and it's not as easy to become a citizen as in some areas of the world. So it's more difficult in that regard. But my experience has been you can still get IP rights, and those IP rights are still respected whether you're a citizen of that region or an immigrant or otherwise in that region. I don't know what your experience is, Kevin, but that's my
I agree. I was going to comment on the second half of this question here, the right of publicity. That's an interesting question, and people on the call may have heard of this or maybe not, but Cristiano Ronaldo signed recently with a soccer team, I believe in Saudi Arabia, who will be paying him more than 200 million euros under the contract. So, they there have been articles on the human rights front saying, should Cristiano Ronaldo be giving his basically brand approval, his reach to Saudi Arabia? And I think in this case, obviously they would protect the right to publicity for him, because they're not going to allow, let's say campaigners or folks to misappropriate his image and basically tarnish or hurt the image of Saudi Arabia or the soccer team he's playing for. So I think the right of publicity will be super important as more deals like that are closed.
I would agree with Kevin too. I think a lot of that is done by contract enforcement and trademark rights and registering brands related to the image. But and I think also those who know FIFA has a very aggressive protection program for anything related to their intellectual property. And they don't even go into a World Cup region where the World Cup and won't accept going to the World Cup in an area unless the rights are highly respected. And that was true for Qatar and the Arabian Peninsula in this instance. So they were very strict on who were their licensees, who they got approval for, who could use the soccer emblems and names and images, and these publicity rights were done by contracts. So that's where I would encourage people that are going over there thinking about that. Look to how those athletes, those companies, and those teams implement their image rights and publicity rights related to contracts.
Okay, great. We've made some good time here. What I'll do is we've got a few questions left, and I think then I'll wrap up. I think the last two substantive questions, I may be able to combine them. They're really on sort of harmonization, or if they're sort of following similar things across jurisdictions. The prior question to that is adding to the creative IP question. And then there's also an administrative question. Adding to the creative IP question, is there a protection system in place for GCC countries that want to use IP created in the US? In other words, do the GCC countries take IP seriously, or is it more of a wild west culture where they're pulling material from online and using it at their leisure and using it within their own IP?
So in the first part, IP created in the US, I mean, when you're talking patents and trademarks, the GCC countries are, I talked about this at the beginning, part of the Paris Convention and the Patent Cooperation Treaty. So as long as you file in the US or file in Europe, or file in a first filing country, wherever that might be, yes, then you can go into the GCC off that original filing within certain time periods. I have not seen that the GCC countries are Wild West. I mean, people used to say this about China, and when you were going into China with, patents, trade secrets, copyright, trademark, it was kind of a free-for-all. But even that is changing. I mean, particularly with large companies, mid-sized companies, I certainly don't think it's a Wild West. I think it's a place where you have such large potentials for economic growth that companies, I think, are respecting these rights in the sense they don't want to offend the wrong person. I mean, if you offend the big company that accounts for 70% of your revenue, it's not going to be a good outcome. So I wouldn't call it a Wild West.
I agree with Kevin. I think you might have seen it. You might have considered Wild West 15 years ago or so, but I think it's not quite that way anymore. I think companies are recognizing the difference between respecting IP and treating copyrights, patents, and trademarks well. in those countries. There's much more respect. There is some risk, that it will occur. It's just like in any other developing areas. But I think both Kevin and myself have seen significant improvements in this area over the last, decade. I mean, like leaps and bounds, and which is really pleasing. And part of that's related to, moving into WIPO compliance and becoming members of more and more treaty organizations that show their respect for IP and how they treat it. They're trying to develop their own industry and their own local industries. And so if you're saying you do something here and then you don't protect something there, you don't pursue protection, then they're going to have a right to use IP over there at some level. If you don't seek your own protection at some level. So it's just like other countries too. So if you're going into Brazil or Chile or other regions of the world, filing is really important if you're going to be practicing or distributing in those regions at a significant level.
Great. Okay, thank you. So a couple of questions that I think we'll probably wrap up after these questions, and they may be related thoughts. So let me ask a few, and then I'll do some wrap up kind of administrative things here. So there's a question regarding procedures in GCC compliance with the Patent Law Treaty. If not, are procedures in GCC compliant with the Patent Law Treaty? If not, can a member of GCC that is also a PLT member use the GCC services? And then separately, and there may be some connection here with harmonizing AI technology with the current patent system, particularly in regards to AI having eligibility as an inventor or not. Do GCC countries have discussions for AI? So I'd rather prompt these two topics together, and I think there'll be one more question and we'll wrap up.
On the first one there, GCC is compliant with the Patent Cooperation Treaty. We talked about that, where basically you can, as long as you're following the timelines prescribed by first filing, and then your priority window, then you can use the GCC services. But like I said at the beginning, the way you file in GCC countries is changing right now. Individual national countries versus one GCC filing, but they are part of the Patent Cooperation Treaty. The second one on AI, I think every patent office is still working on how to deal with that. I know in the US and Europe, there's tons of discussion going on. I would imagine it's going on in the GCC as well, but I think the GCC will adopt, ultimately whatever the US or Europe or Korea or Japan ends up doing. I think right now they typically look to other regions to figure out how they're going to adapt their local law.
I agree with Kevin on the AI issue. I think they're having those discussions. I've seen discussions on media and other places about that issue. But I think they tend to lean towards what Europe and the US are doing in that region, in terms of not necessarily recognizing AI as an inventor, if in patents, looking more for individuals to be inventors. From that sorts, I think that's the way they're leaning from what I've seen there as well.
Okay, great discussion about PCT and AI. And so one final question here, and then we'll wrap up. And it's been great having this great discussion. Final question is, could you please comment on foreign filing license issues for locally developed innovations in the GCC?
It varies country by country. So for people on the call today, a foreign filing license is the idea that if let's say you file US provisional patent application or non-provisional patent application. Typically with that filing, you're automatically granted a foreign filing license so that the application can also be filed in other countries, let's say China. Alternatively, if you, let's say, have a US inventor and you have a Chinese inventor and you want to file your first application in China, you would have to apply to the US Patent Office to get a foreign filing license to file first in China. And this actually varies country by country. I know, India has unique requirements, just about every country, and there's actually a WIPO, World Intellectual Property Organization chart that shows you country by country what the foreign filing license requirements are. So I don't know off the top of my head what they are for each individual GCC country, but there is a good WIPO information on what's required. And this would come up if you had, say, an inventor in the US, an inventor in Saudi Arabia, and an inventor in Kuwait. Before you file a patent application, you'd want to make sure you have the correct foreign filing licenses.
And I'll just add, I agree with Kevin. I would think, from my experience, the GCC countries are more lenient than even countries like India and China. So they're much more flexible in terms of being able to file internationally than India and China are for their citizens. And so if you invent something over there, if you're an Indian citizen, then you may also have to, depend on the situation on employment, you may have to get clearance to file in India. But you'll also have these companies that will have ventures in China or India or US or whatever, and they have to comply with those laws too when they file in those countries as well. So again, my experience is that they're more lenient than other countries in terms of the foreign filing license.
Great. Thank you very much. I just want to wrap up in a few moments. I think we'll be done at 45 past the hour. So first, I just want to thank all the panelists for their time, valuable thoughts here, and sharing their wonderful experiences. And it's been a great discussion. We've talked largely about the GCC, but broadly about Muslim majority countries. Saad especially had talked about other countries out of the GCC, but this has been a really insightful discussion, adding to sort of both academic, practical, policy, business-related concepts in IP and innovation policy. So first, I want to thank Kevin and Jeff and Saad for their participation and time here. It's been really insightful. Really want to thank you for everything. It's been great. Also, I want to point out, just on an administrative side, there'll be even some more great panels and webinars and conferences, some of which I alluded to, including in late April, where there's a panel on the future of IP and religion. This is with George Mason University that has hosted this particular webinar, and we'll have more programming throughout going forward. As far as just logistics, just would let to answer the question about the slides being available. So the recording will be available, and it'll include the slides, so you can always watch the recording, but we'll let the we're going to ask the speakers for permission about sharing anything such as the slides, and we'll get back on that, but the recording will be available on the website. And, I also want to thank the team here with George Mason University, Mary Claire, Christina, Joshua, and Sean, and many others for their efforts and great programming and organization. It's been wonderful having everybody. And again, first, I want to thank also the attendees and the panelists. So I'm going to wrap up here. I really appreciate it. My name again is Tabrez Ebrahim, and I want to thank Kevin and Jeff and Saad for their participation. Thank you very much. And we'll wrap up here.
Professor Ebrahim. And
yeah, thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.